Holy moly, so much knitting has gone on. I started a project over. Well, but I actually think that the fit is perfect. Like, it could not be any better. It looks to me like such an heirloom quality piece, and I got really lucky because I found the perfect yarn. Wait until you see this. Here we go.
I'm Nora, and this is also known as Nora Knits.
Hello there, I'm Nora, and you're watching, also known as Nora Knits. Thank you so much for joining me for another podcast episode today. Happy Rhinebeck weekend to those of you who are going. If you're watching this on Saturday morning, then I am going to be at Rhinebeck as we are speaking. And so if you're watching and then going, if you see me, please feel free to stop and say hello. I would absolutely love to meet you. And otherwise, just thanks so much for choosing to hang out with me today. Oh, there's a fly in here. Oh my gosh, did you just see it almost land on my face? Like I said, I'm Nora. I'm coming to you from a small farm in Connecticut, and I have been knitting for just over a year and a half now. Oh my gosh, that fly is going to cause some problems. I could tell already. I'm primarily a garment knitter. I really am. I would call myself just a sweater knitter. I am not one to knit too many accessories, but who knows? That could always change. And I really do love to make with the philosophy that the imperfections are what make something so perfectly handmade. I don't like to take myself or my knitting too seriously. I enjoy it for what it is. And I just really love the idea of being able to make my own clothes, to make the things that I see in my head the way that I want to. And so that philosophy just helps me to keep the pressure off of the knitting too much and really just do it for the love of knitting. So if you feel like that's something that you could get behind, I definitely would love it if you would come hang out with us more often. I post podcast videos just like this one every Saturday morning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And with that out of the way, I am excited. I have a finished object to tell you about today. And oh my gosh, am I excited about it? I've got a couple of whips, a new cast on. I am going to tell you why I started a project over from the beginning, which also involved an acquisition. And I think we have a lot to chat about. So we should just go ahead and dive on in. Let us start out with a bang by talking about the cardigan that I'm wearing right now. This is my finished object. And this, I am just going to say it right now, is probably the most proud I've ever been of a finished object. It's I've loved most of the things that I have made, and there's just something about this that when I look at it, it looks to me like such an heirloom quality piece, and the enjoyment that I had in the making process, I think has definitely bled into my sort of adornment of the finished object that you're seeing here today. So I'm very excited to tell you a little bit more about it. This is the Beatrix cardigan that's by Gregoria Fibers. It was my first time knitting one of her patterns, and it will not be the last, just based on the experience I had with this project. I have knit mine out of Lamb's Pride worsted in the colorway Chocolate Souffle, and I held it together with Knit Picks alpaca alpaca cloud lace and the colorway Hamlet. So that's a 100% wool and then a 100% baby alpaca lace weight held together to create the fabric that you're seeing. I knit mine in the size 5 on the recommended 5mm needles. I really did not make many modifications to this pattern. I'm tempted to say that I did not make any modifications to this pattern, but I only feel that way because the few changes that I did make, they don't affect the finished result that you're seeing exactly. So I'll tell you a little bit about those in a minute. So the whole thing's worked up on 5 millimeter needles, which makes it a pretty quick and easy project. And I was talking about last week, I've been going on since I started this about how much I've loved knitting it. And I got a lot of comments from people saying that they're intimidated by all of the all over texture and everything that you're seeing here. And I'm really glad that those people commented saying that, because I would like to continue just demystifying some of these things that look a little more tricky in knitting. And this is another sort of philosophy that I've shared before, where I really love knits that look complicated but aren't so complicated to knit. And it's usually done by these simple stitch maneuvers or stitches that are created that are very they have a big impact with minimal effort. That's my saying. Big impact, minimal effort. And I would definitely say that this is one of those knits, because looking at it visually, it's very stimulating. There is a lot going on between all of the cabling down the sleeves and the texture across the body and the buttons and the button loops and the ribbing. And it looks like something that would be so involved to knit. But because of the construction of this one, it's a saddle shoulder design. And then also with the actual stitch pattern that makes up this majority of the cardigan, it's so clever. It's really done in these sort of chunks and segments that make it really, really attainable and more easy to grasp if you're not someone who's really confident in texture knitting. So what I mean by that specifically for this piece is that when you cast on for the back of the neck, and that sort of turns into the back neckline, as well as it kind of comes across the shoulders this way. And then that is turned into the saddle shoulder. The saddle shoulder is made up of the cable. So when you're knitting that cable saddle shoulder, you are not dealing with anything but the cable. It's done in such a way that it's just this one section. It's one thing that you have to worry about. You don't have to put stitch markers in and count where you're going to have the cable and keep track of 5 things at once. It's just this cable that you're knitting then down to the points of the shoulder sleeve seam and putting that on hold. You do the same thing on the other side. So already that's just 2 really intimidating looking sections that are done right off the bat. From there, you're picking up stitches across the back of those saddle shoulders that you've made, and then incorporating the cast on edge that was the back of the neck. And that's where you're starting the texture that makes up this sweater. And this texture is a series of, I don't know how you would really say it other than you're knitting a couple of stitches, you're increasing, and then it's done by casting off a stitch or those 2 stitches. I don't know exactly how you would phrase that, but the important part is that if you've done a standard bind off, a standard cast off bind off, where you knit 2 stitches and then scoop the first one over the second one and cast that off, if you've done that before, then you can knit this stitch pattern. It's extremely intuitive. It's a 2-row repeat. And it's once you've finished the swatch, which you swatch in the stitch pattern, you are memorized. So don't let the look of this, the high impact look, make you feel like it's a huge effort to create, because it's actually very simple. But when it's done in such abundance, it looks really exciting and really intimidating and really intriguing and really complicated, just because it's the same couple of stitches repeated over and over. And because you've already worked the saddle shoulder, now you're just working across the back. There are short rows in there. So there's a little bit of just, following the pattern, but she explains the short rows so clearly that if you've never knit short rows in a pattern before, so maybe you've knit German short rows in stockinette, but you've never done it with texture or lace or anything, I think that this is a really great way to get into that because she does explain it and lay it out just beautifully in the pattern. But once you get past those short rows, you're just knitting a rectangle with this stitch pattern till you get to the underarm, and then you do the same thing on the front. Now, this is where I was nervous. I thought there was going to be a lot to keep track of because you have these beautiful button placket details that have a little cable running down them. And I thought, oh gosh, now I'm going to have to keep track of the stitch pattern and then get the cable needle out and then figure out which row I'm on. And that's actually not how it goes. You just knit the stitch pattern straight down to the underarm again. Once you reach that point, you join in the flats, not in the round because it's a cardigan, but you join under the arms and you just continue knitting that same stitch pattern all the way down until you start the ribbing that's on the bottom of this. So those are the couple of sections you've done now, are the saddle shoulder up until the sleeve. Those were done on their own independently, so there was nothing else to worry about. Then all of this stitch pattern that makes up the body, you're not worrying about button bands and sleeves and cables. It's just that stitch pattern worked over and over and over again. Then you go back and knit the sleeves. And by then you've been working this stitch pattern for so long that it is really second nature. And what you're then focusing on is just knitting it while knitting the cable. And so I utilized a couple of stitch markers to indicate where the stitch pattern that makes up the sweater was ending, where we were starting this sort of stockinette purl sequence that kind of borders the cable, then another stitch marker for the cable itself, and so on. So it becomes way more attainable because you've already knit the body. It's just such second nature. You've had so much practice knitting this stitch pattern at that point that to incorporate the cable, by the time you get there, it's easy peasy. Plus, you've already practiced this cable on the saddle shoulder. So it's just, it's like coming back to the same thing. It's nothing new. It's just returning back home in a different way. Knitting down to the cuffs, there are decreases worked in here. Again, very clearly laid out in the pattern. And then you come back and you knit the button band. And this is its own section in itself. So again, it's just done in its own chunk, and all you have to worry about is the button band itself. It's beautifully written, clearly laid out. The only thing that I changed about mine is that I do believe that there's a discrepancy in the pattern, and I don't know if it is the definition for the cable, what the front and back cable. It's either the definition was written wrong or you're told in the pattern to do the wrong style of cable. Something was a little funny where they were both going to turn the same direction, and that's not what you see in the object photos. So I just changed that direction of the cable on one of the sides so that both of my cables were turning out. And that's done by just choosing whether you're going to hold the stitches in the front or the back of the fabric while you're knitting the cable. I did the whole button band without a cable needle, so that also was something so simple. And you essentially just kind of work up one side, then you work down the other side, and then you go back and pick up the stitches around the collar, and that's what creates this really lovely 1x1 ribbed collar. Now, that's where we were last week. And all I had left to do was block this piece and add the buttons as well as the button holes. I don't know what you would call it, button loops, button holes. And I had these brass buttons they were in my stash, and I knew that I wanted to use them on this cardigan. I really loved the way that they looked with the chocolate brown fabric, and that they provided a little bit of a sheen, a little bit of a hardness to combat the just overall soft fuzziness and more, the overall cardigan gives off a little bit more of like a rustic vibe. And so I liked the idea of these metal buttons providing a little bit more edge to that. And this is where I've made my other sort of modification. There is a tutorial in the pattern she refers you to. It's actually a Lily Kate France tutorial that she refers you to make the button loops. And the way that Lily Kate had done them was by taking 2 strands of the yarn and basically determining the size that you needed for the button loop. And then using a needle with the yarn, you were doing a blanket stitch around that length that you'd created. And that made the button loops. Now, I was struggling with that a little bit. I think because I don't know why. It wasn't working. And so I thought I would try it with a crochet hook instead. And the way that you're instructed to do this is by putting getting yourself in the position where you're going to want that button loop first and then creating the button loop. That was also stressing me out because I couldn't quite figure out exactly where I needed the button loop and then how long I needed it and then holding it in place. It was a little finicky. So I thought it would be easiest to actually just create the button loops themselves and then sew them on after the fact. I realize now that I should have made a video or something on how to do this. So let me know if that's something that you guys want, and I will try to create a video on how I made these button loops. But basically what I had done, it was a little bit of trial and error to figure out the exact size. And what it came down to was me using a crochet hook and the yarn I'd worked with, the Lamb's Pride only. I actually didn't use the alpaca lace because I really needed something smaller. They still are pretty chunky button loops, but they were coming out really big. And so I was just trying to get the smallest button loop possible. So I figured out how long I needed that loop to be to go from the edge of the button placket around the button, fit pretty snugly, and then hold it together so that these 2 edges were kind of just butting up against each other without overlapping, without gapping too much. And what I determined in the end, again, I tried a bunch of different things, or a bunch of different stitch counts, and what I landed on was 6 chains. So I did a slip knot on a crochet hook. I chained 6. Then I inserted the crochet hook back into the first chain so that I made myself a loop, almost as if you're starting a granny square without a magic circle. So if you're starting a granny square with just a chain stitch, then that's basically what I had done to start. From there, I had done, again, this was trial and error. So I started with, 5 chains, 8 chains, and found that the 6 worked the best. Then I inserted my hook through that circle, again, like you're making the center of a granny square, scooped up my yarn and created a single crochet around the chain. So that was really encompassing the chain. I believe that the final number that I landed on was 10 of those single crochets around, and that filled out the button loop and enclosed that whole chain without it being too dense so that it was like weebly wobbly and like a little too firm, but also those stitches weren't slip sliding around. Once I had done that, when I got to the very end, I just cut the yarn and pulled that yarn through. And I made sure that the slip stitch that I started with, as well as that slip stitch that I ended with, both had really long tails. And that was how I was going to sew them on. For me, this worked out way more easily than trying to actually build the button loop off of the cardigan, keeping everything in place, trying to figure out exactly where I was going to position it. That was getting tricky for me. So I made 5 button loops individually. And at that point, I started with the bottom loop, and I really just eyeballed this to butt the two fronts up to each other, place that button loop kind of where it was going to be best. I would put it around the button itself and then kind of see where the ends were happiest on the right side of the button placket. And then I just used the needle with those two ends and I stitched it to the edge of the cardigan. I would kind of insert my needle through the button placket, go back into the button loop itself until it was sitting really flat and flush, because I noticed that if I didn't make enough contact with the button loop and the button placket, it was kind of wanting to turn or lift and torque from the middle. So I was just kind of eyeballing things and I was stitching it until it sat flat and happy. And then I weaved in my ends and snipped them off. And the way that I like to do my button loops on like a normal or button placement on a normal cardigan, I apply that same sort of theory to this, even though this wasn't buttonholes placed prior and then adding buttons. It was the buttons were already on here and then adding the button loops. So first I added the buttons. I started by just placing the top and the bottom one wherever I thought that they looked best. I did not measure. I just eyeballed what looked good to me and I sewed those two on. From there, I measured the distance from the center of the top and the bottom button and divided that number by the amount of buttons that I had, which was 5. From there, I was able to find the center point and insert my center button and then measure that distance from each button so that they were winding up as equidistant from each other as possible. And then when it came time to adding the button loops, I started with the bottom button, like I said, just eyeballing where it needed to go. Then I worked to the top button while the bottom one was closed up. Once I added a button loop, I closed that part of the cardigan and I had it laid out in front of me. And I was just trying to keep everything close to each other and really even. And from there, I did the center one, kept that closed while I then closed up the next two. And by doing that, I was avoiding any additional tension that I might have created. Had I started, say, at the top and then worked my way down, I could have been constantly pulling on one side of the cardigan more than the other. And then when you get to the bottom, you realize that you've placed your button loop in such a way that the whole thing is kind of cockeyed. So I like to go from the bottom to the top to the middle to the two in between. And I think that it really worked out. Now, like I said, these button loops, they are chunky. They're super, super chunky. I think that it looks really cute when they're closed. I'm like 80% happy with how they look when they're open. That being said, I don't know how often I would wear it open, and I don't not like it when it's open. I just think that these loops are a little bit much, but I really couldn't figure out a way to make them any smaller. So yeah, I also have yet to block the button loops. I blocked the cardigan in its entirety and then went back and added the buttons and the loops. And so I never reblocked the loops or anything like that. That didn't seem necessary. But overall, I am very happy with the way that it looks. I even think having just the one done is really cute. And I'll play around with it a little bit more. But if you have a suggestion for how to do these button loops without them winding up so chunky, everything I did made them really, really chunky. So if you have a suggestion for ways that you could create button loops in this style of closure where they do look a little bit better when it's open, I'd love to know. I think that these are great. I don't know if I'll ever redo them because I think it's actually kind of adds to the charm of the cardigan that it has those little loops. And it almost reminds me of like a military style jacket where it would have the sort of loop toggle closures. I'll try to put a picture of what I'm picturing exactly, but I just think it looks really, really sweet and I just love it so, so much. So I think that was all of the rambling that I had to do. Let me give you the final rundown for this finished object. I am going to read it here off of the iPad. So, like I said, this pattern is the Beatrix cardigan by Gregoria Fibers. The pattern price is about $8.10 on Ravelry. And this pattern was gifted to me by a lovely viewer, so thank you so much. The yarn that I used, like I said, I used two different yarns held together. One was that Lamb's Pride worsted in the colorway Chocolate Souffle, and the other was the Knit Picks Alpaca Cloud lace in the colorway Hamlet. This yarn was not in my stash, so I did purchase, well, half of the yarn was in the stash. The Lamb's Pride was in my stash, and then I purchased the Knit Picks to go along with it. So the Lamb's Pride yarn at full price runs around $15.80 per skein. However, I thrifted this yarn at an incredible price of $1.50 a skein, and I wound up using a total of it was exactly 7 full balls of the yarn. And that included my swatch, the button loops, and everything. I have exactly 3 skeins left over as I purchased this in a bag of 10 of them. So this used exactly 7 of those skeins of yarn, which means that had I purchased that yarn at full price, it would have been about $110.60. However, because I thrifted it, my yarn total comes to $10.50 for the Lamb's Pride worsted yarn. As for the Knit Picks Alpaca Cloud lace, the full price for that yarn is $8.99. I did find this on sale on that Knit Picks' website, and so I paid about $7.19 per skein. Now, I'm saying that I used 3 skeins. I will tell you that I literally had a single row where I had to tap into a 4th skein of the Knit Picks Alpaca Cloud lace. However, I firmly believe that had I just ripped out my swatch, I could have gotten that extra row out of this. And honestly, it just seems like more work to do that than it did to tap into that 4th skein. I also, if I only had the 3 skeins, I very much feel like I could have just weaseled out that last row without the Knit Picks Alpaca Cloud. So I'm going to call this 3 skeins because I really only used like a yard of the 4th skein that I had, which means that had I purchased that at full price, it would have been $26.97. But because I found it on sale, that Knit Picks yarn total was about $21.57. And basically that means that had I paid full price for the yarn in total, it would have been $137.57. However, I only paid $32.07 because I found those yarns thrifted as well as on sale. Now, the buttons, I can't remember exactly how much I paid for these, but it was when the yarn shop was closing, and I think that I only paid maybe 25 cents per button. They were extremely cheap. So let's just be fair and call it about $2 for the 5 buttons and guesstimate that that was about what we spent. So this means that had I paid full price for the yarn, had the pattern not been gifted to me, I would have spent about $147.67 on this project. However, because the pattern was gifted and because I thrifted and found this yarn on sale, my project total comes to about $34.07. And that is for a project that took me about 33 days to complete. Now, personally, I think that this cardigan looks extremely luxurious and like something that you would only find at a super high-end store, and I am so thrilled with it. So absolutely that price of around that $30 mark for a project that took around 30 days, it's basically $1 a day. I am beyond satisfied with it. I also did want to say, and you'll have seen it in the before and after blocking, that the sleeves on this did in fact block out as much as I thought they would. They're really a beautifully relaxed fit without being too big. And my experience with cardigan sleeves is that the more that you wear them, they do tend to stretch out a little bit more anyway. So I think right now the fit on these sleeves, it's just absolutely perfect. I love the length of them. They're sitting just at that sort of the base of the thumb, and that's perfect for being able to wear this while kind of getting around and doing things. And then it does have plenty of positive ease in the body, especially obviously if it's closed, then even more so. And I believe that I knit mine a little bit longer in the body than it was listed in the pattern. And I think that my ribbing all over is just a little bit longer of a ribbing than she tells you in the pattern. So that is that on the Beatrix cardigan. By the way, if it is helpful, all of my measurements are listed in the description box. So if you're interested in knitting this garment or anything else that I talk about today and you're looking for a reference in size, then I would definitely refer down there. And yeah, let me know if you have any other questions for this one. I would love to just encourage you to give it a shot if it's something that you're interested in. I really loved this process. All right, moving on. I think, no, like we're already 30 minutes into this. I will just chat so briefly about my Tulsa tank by Rebecca Clow. This is my sort of mindless knitting, my handbag knitting, and it looks like I put in about an inch on this guy over the past week. I'm knitting this in Drops Fabelle in the red colorway, and I'm knitting mine on smaller needles than she suggests even for the fingering weight. I just wanted a fabric that wasn't quite as gappy because I'm going for about 0 to negative ease on this garment. So this is a bottom up tank top, which means that I am just working my way to the point of the underarm, and this is something that really, this is my lowest priority knit. So I just wanted to mention I got about an inch done on this, as it was really great to have in my handbag this week for just a little bit of mindless knitting when I found myself hanging out in some spots that I wasn't expecting to be. So that's my Tulsa tank progress for this week. This project has been on the needles for 96 days. Now, the next exciting whip that we're going to talk about today is getting so close to being done, and that is my Cordelia skirt by Witchery Design. I'm knitting mine out of Drops Belle in the colorways mint cream and black. Mine is in the size extra large, and since last week, we left off with this blocking after I finished knitting the waistband, and I have since sewn in the elastic for the waistband, and this has been blocked. So I tried it on last week. I felt like we're getting really close to the length of this skirt, and that was why I chose to block it after knitting the waistband height, which is a folded over waistband, and it has it encloses an elastic inside. So I had finished the knitting on this waistband and I had not yet sewn it down, but I wanted to block it and then put in the elastic so that I could then try this on really properly and determine how close we are to the finished length of this. Now, I will say that I've tried this on briefly, and you may have noticed already that the needles are back on this because it's not quite where I thought it was. I really did think that this was going to lengthen a bit more in blocking, and it didn't. I know that over time this will stretch out a little bit, but I don't want to bank on that and then make this too short, because if it's too short, I know I'm not going to wear it. So I'm going to, I think, lay this out on the skirt that I own that I'm kind of trying to mimic the style of. That's a linen skirt that I have. And I think I will be able now to determine from that skirt how much longer I need to knit this, because it would be a little tricky for me to put this on and like measure the length exactly. So I will use that as a reference from now on. But I will say that after this is blocked, even before it blocked, I am so thrilled with the fit of this. It's fitting exactly how I'd like it to fit. I put the elastic in. The way that I had done that was I actually just took the elastic I had. It's a 1.5 inch elastic, and I was wrapping it around my waist in the place where I wanted to wear it. And I was just kind of giving it like a little bit of a tug to make sure that I didn't want this to sit, I didn't want the elastic to fit without being at all stretched over the waist, because then it kind of tends to like stand off of the waist. So I wanted it at such a sort of circumference that it was just ever so slightly like a little bit of negative ease in that elastic. And I feel like I got that exactly. So when I then cut the elastic, I took it over to my sewing machine and I gave myself an inch of overlap, and I used a zigzag stitch I basically just went around the sort of square that made up that inch of overlap of the fabric and went over quite a few times to make sure that that was not going anywhere. So then I was working with the actual loop of the elastic that I created for the waist, and I popped my live stitches back on the needle. They were on some tried-on tubing from blocking. And I used a crochet hook and made a like slip stitch edge. I am really happy with the way that this turned out. I have yet to sew in all of these ends that I've wound up with. But basically what I had done is I tucked the elastic inside of the folded point of the waistband. And I literally took the crochet hook, took the first stitch off of the needle, inserted the crochet hook and the corresponding stitch that was on the base of that waistband knitting, and pulled up the loop of yarn and did a slip stitch through then those two stitches that I had. So the one from the needle, the one that I went underneath that was at the base of the waistband, and then pulled up the loop and pulled it through all of the stitches. I made it a point to pull those loops up really tall so that these slip stitches were very elongated and therefore were not too tight, because I was nervous that this would not stretch with the slip stitch, but I think it looks fantastic and it works extremely well. I'm probably going to just hand stitch a couple spots in the back where that overlap is, and just secure the top and bottom of the elastic to the actual knit fabric. You ever have a waistband where it starts rolling on you and twisting and flipping inside of its little channel that's there for it? I would like to avoid that. So I think just in the back, tacking a couple of spots will help it to not flip and roll and twist and all of that. But I worked that all the way around. And then when I got to the end, I just created one more slip stitch and then pulled every scrap that I had through. So from the beginning of the slip stitch sort of enclosure, from the beginning of where I picked up for the waistband, from any little tail that was there, I pulled all of that through the slip stitch. And now I just have to sew that down, weave in the ends, and I will get around to that when I weave in the rest of the ends. For now, I would love to see this done by next week, but I do have to figure out just how much knitting I have left to do. And then at the very bottom, it just finishes off with a little bit of ribbing. So we're very close with this skirt, and I'm very excited to have it done. Especially now after seeing the way that it fits. I was a little nervous that I was going to make this tighter than I wanted it to be, and then I wouldn't be so comfortable wearing it. But I actually think that the fit is perfect. Like, it could not be any better. So happy about this. As of today, this project has been on the needles for 70 days. So hopefully, fingers crossed, that's going to be done for next week. Okay, now remember at the top of the episode when I said that I started a project over? Well, if you were here last week, you may remember having seen this. The humble beginnings of a new sweater cast on. This is a test knit that I'm doing for Emma Mayer, Emma's Knits. This is going to be the Artemesia Sweater. It's a boucle raglan sweater that features really clean and classic lines in that the collar and the cuffs and the hem, they're all done in this stockinette folded over fabric that just looks really crisp up against the sort of fun and frilliness of the boucle. And as this is a test knit, I was really eager to get it cast on because there was a deadline, and I wound up casting on sort of in a haste with a yarn that I purchased, a yarn that I had for this collar, and then kept knitting in the boucle. And I said last week, like, I'm really not thrilled with the collar, but I have to get this going. It's a test knit. There's a deadline. And I had quite a few comments that said, you don't like it. And if you don't like it, why bother? And I was like, you're right. You're right. And so I paused. I paused on this after having worked on it for a few days. This was a few days of knitting, and I was feeling really guilty about it because I wanted to get the test knit going, but I just couldn't get on board with the marling that I was getting in this collar. Now, the yarn that is made up, the body of this cardigan, the body of this sweater is made up with mohair by Canard, their boucle. And that was the yarn that I had purchased for the test knit through Emma's affiliation with the Mohair by Canard brand. We got 50% off of this yarn as testers. And then there was another yarn that was supposed to go with it for the collar that I forgot to purchase with everything else. So I was scrambling to find something that I could make work. And I wound up using this brand. It was called Wool Service, held with some mohair that I had left over. Is the colorway Brown Nougat. And the two colors really created way more of a marl that I would have loved. And I also just wasn't crazy about the fact that overall the collar was giving this very cool tone, while the body of this is such this rich, warm, red, rusty brown. And it really was bugging me. So when I put this on pause, I wound up at Stars Hollow Yarns last Sunday. I was just excited that there was a yarn shop open on a Sunday, if I'm honest. So definitely, if you are in Connecticut, check out Stars Hollow Yarns. They're so amazing, and their yarn shop is one of my favorites. It's a beautiful setting. It's an older house, and it's got the wide plank floors and gorgeous lofty ceilings, and they just have such a different selection of yarn than I've seen anywhere. And I told myself, you have to find yarn today or you keep going with what you've started. And I got really lucky because I found the perfect yarn. Wait until you see this. Okay, I'm going to hold up these individual balls for reference. So this is the boucle. And this is that Wool Service yarn that I had purchased last week. I don't know how well this will come across on camera, that this boucle yarn, it's a rusty red, orange, brown. And this is a very cool mauve undertoned brown. And when I then added in the Brown Nougat mohair, it was a very blonde color, and that was really emphasizing the mauve and cooler undertones that this had, rather than bringing out the rusty red going on in this boucle. Now, I went into the yarn shop with a few options. I said I could either find a mohair that has a rusty reddish undertone to it that I could still hold with this Wool Service yarn, and that would give me a closer look to what I'm going for. Or I could find a yarn to replace this one and also a mohair to match. Or I could find a yarn that was a little bit thicker than this to use on its own for the collar. Or I could use a yarn a little bit finer than this to hold double for the collar. That all would be a better color match for this. So I had all of these options, but also felt kind of guilty because I did already purchase. This was quite expensive, even though it was 50% off. And then I bought this yarn solely for this purpose, and it was on sale, but it was still a $10 purchase that was just adding to this overall cost. And when I found then this yarn, I'd like to state here that I fully recognize that I might be the only person who actually sees a difference between the three things in my hand right now. But if you're seeing this with me, please tell me that you agree that this is a way better color for this than this is. Let me actually hold them like so. So now we have the boucle yarn with this almost exact match. This yarn is a new to me yarn. This is called Woolfolk Tinned, Tynd, and it's color 30. It is 223 yards to 50 grams, and it says somewhere on here, and it's 100% merino wool. Now, I was thrilled to see that the color matched so well, but I wasn't so thrilled that the price of this yarn, it was $20, I think it was $21 a skein. And having already bought the boucle, having already spent an additional $10 on this guy, it just felt like this was becoming a very expensive project. It still is, but I felt clever in my solution. Because the collar and everything on this is a folded over, there's a backside that you're not seeing. And so rather than purchasing enough of this yarn to do everything in this new color, I actually only purchased 2 skeins, which will be enough to do half of everything. And then I have 2 of these, which is enough to do half of everything. And so I was able to hold the yarn that I already purchased on the inside of the collar, and then the better match in the collar for the outside. I felt very clever, and I thought it was a great solution to bring down the cost of a project. And I actually think that if you're planning to knit something like this, if you're planning to knit this when it comes out, I love the idea of actually even doing this like intentionally and maybe with some scrap or leftover yarns and having a like pop of color on the inside of those folded over finishes. I think that could be really fun. So this was an acquisition that I had made, still a pricey one. This is still going to be one of the most expensive things I knit all year, but it was worth it to justify the price of the boucle to really love the finished object. So now all of this is being incorporated and I restarted the project. So I've also reset the date of how long it's been on the needles because I truly just started over from scratch. So just a reminder, this is where we were. I went ahead and I just ripped out the needles for this guy. And now, look where we are now. I hope you could see this. I also, for what it's worth, this maybe would not have been the worst thing if I felt like this color combo was better for my complexion. Like if this was a better color for me, I maybe would not have minded it as much, but I really feel like it was just washing me out. Whereas this color creates so much more richness and contrast for my complexion that it was very much worth it. So I will be ripping this out. I just haven't yet. It just seemed easier to start all the way over from the beginning, and that is what I did. And now this particular sweater has only been on my needles for 4 days, and I've been addicted to knitting it. I just can't even tell you how much I love working with the boucle. And because this is a test knit, I'm not going to go crazy about chatting about it. I will tell you so much more when we get to the point where it's being released, but I have split for the sleeves and those raglan increases. And what was I going to say? Oh, last week I had shared some tips for knitting with boucle, and I want to reiterate today that if you plan to knit with boucle, I think you should go check those out because when I got to the point where I was done with all of my raglan increases, I went and I counted all of my stitches, and I had exactly the amount of stitches I was supposed to. I was not going to be surprised had I dropped a stitch or picked up an extra one or increased one too many because I knit a loop instead of the core of the yarn. I was dead on, which means that those tips and tricks worked. And actually, now that I've gotten a few days of practicing knitting with this yarn, I can knit on it without looking most of the time. I would not call this a true knit in the dark, I'm not paying attention to it all type of knit. However, I could watch a TV show and have this knitting in my lap and just glance at it from time to time. So thrilled. The collar here, again, this has the warmer tone on the outside and then the cooler tone on the inside. And the way that I had done that was this is a folded over collar, very similar to the waistbands on the Cordelia skirt where you knit one half, do a purl row, and then knit the other half. So I knit the first half in that cool toned brown. I knit though the last row on that side with the warm brown, then did the purl row in the warm brown, and then the full outside with the warm brown. And that just means that if my fold doesn't sit so perfectly, there's a little bit of a buffer. There's no issue with the purl row having any two-tone to it. And yeah, I'm just thrilled. It's like a squirrel color. It's a very squirrel color, and I love that. I also love that despite the fact that this is designed to be knit with a mohair collar and then the boucle, that it looks beautiful. However, I really like the fact that mine doesn't have the fuzzy factor in the collar. And I think for me, it just really emphasizes it gives a little more casual vibe to this, which is exactly what I want this to be. I want this to just be a casual, fancy sweatshirt. So yeah, so excited. 4 days of knitting, a little bit obscene. This is on 5mm needles, and I am at the point, like I said, where I have joined in the round. So the plan now is to finish up this ball of yarn, and then I'll bounce back to the sleeves, and that's just the way that I like to do things. So that is the Artemesia sweater. It's a test knit. I will let you know when this is out, and it's been on the needles for 4 days today. We've been chatting. Also, Helena the Hanga hasn't even made an appearance because nothing is in a state where I could really put it on. I guess I could have thrown the Artemesia sweater on there, but we'll have to do that next week instead. So last but not least, I did go ahead and cast on something new. This came from... Oh, the Cordelia skirt was still blocking. I had to wait for this to finish blocking to start blocking that. So there was a little bit of a weird overlap. That's kind of why the Artemesia got as much work done on it as she had. Obviously, I could have been working on the sand cardigan, but you get it. And then I just felt like I needed one more sort of thing going on the needles because the Artemesia sweater was just in the round at this point. So I cast on my 2024 holiday dress. And this is the Grayling sweater by Magdalena Parker, Knitonomy. It is a really fun, oversized, chunky, cabled sweater that I will be knitting into a long dress. And these are the most humble beginnings. So I'm not going to be going crazy chatting with you guys all about what's going on here, but I have started. Can you even see? Here we go. So it's a drop shoulder design, which means that the back in this case is being knit in that sort of trapezoid shape and you're increasing on your way down. So really I've just started. I'm knitting mine out of Knit Picks Wonder Fluff. This colorway, do I know the name of this colorway? Heather Coffee or something? I'll definitely have the name on the screen, but it's a blown yarn. So it's been really interesting to work with. It's incredibly soft. And right now I'm just, this part's a little tedious. You've got a lot of increases that you're squeezing into not a lot of space because this yarn is blown yarn. It's very fuzzy, so it's kind of tricky to see. Also because it's a blown yarn, when it's just sitting on its own is quite fluffy and chunky, but as soon as you tug it, it really can get quite small and tiny. And so I've had a few instances where I've done an increase, and I think I just was pulling on the yarn so much to squeeze an increase into a spot where it didn't really want to go, and therefore wound up with just very tight stitches on the needle. So I've been trying to kind of work around that and learn as I go. My main finding with this one is the only reason I really wanted to even share this today is I was finding that with these really wide set cables, it's a lot of stitches that make up the cable, and then you have the purl stitches in between. And I found that I was getting these baggy stitches, and I've heard people talk about this before, and I've had it in other cabled knits, but never quite this severe. I think it's a combination of the blown yarn because there's not quite as that much bounce back like a standard wool would have. But also because of the amount of stitches that you're crossing over each other, there's just like a lot of tension in funny places. So what was happening is that you would work your way across the knits that make up the cable, and then when you'd get to the purl sections in between, that first purl is just winding up really loose ends and sloppy looking. And so about halfway through, I decided I should try to figure out what to do about it. And I came across a video where I learned to knit the knits, and then when you do the first purl, instead of, so you hold the yarn in front. I'm an English knitter. You hold the yarn in front, you insert your needle purlwise, and then you would typically wrap that yarn around the needle, going, if you're looking at a clock, counterclockwise. So you're kind of grabbing that yarn and pulling it from the 3 o'clock up to the 12 back behind the needle. And instead of doing that, they said to actually hold the yarn and pull it kind of from the 9 o'clock to the 12 o'clock and then around behind the needle. So you're knitting it then clockwise. What then that results in is a twisted stitch. So then when you're on the other side, the wrong side of the fabric coming back, you have to knit that stitch through the back loop, but it's supposed to snug up the stitches a little bit. Now, I've only done that for the past few rows. So while I do feel like I see a difference, I don't think it's the most prominent difference there's ever been. And so I'm just going to have to keep playing with it. So all that to say, if you have a favorite way of avoiding that awkwardly loose stitch in between your cables, then definitely please let us know in the comments, because I feel like I could use all the help I could get on this one. Anyway, I'm just planning to get this started. I literally just threw this onto the needles yesterday, and I'm probably going to just get it going and then put it down for a little bit while I start some other projects. It was really just that I couldn't look at the Artemesia anymore after I had knit so much on it for a few days. And I was waiting to hear some things back from the designer. Anyway, circumstances just led to me wanting to cast on something new. And that's what this is. So yes, this will be my 2024 holiday dress, and it is based on the Grayling sweater by Magdalena Parker, but I'm knitting mine in a dress form, and it's been on the needles for a day. Holy moly, so much knitting has gone on. Really excited about the things that I've had on the needles. Thank you for sticking with me through this rather long episode. So I mentioned that acquisition that I had, that was the Woolfolk yarn, and I'll let you know how that goes working on it. Another sort of acquisition that I had is something that was gifted to me. This is Claudia Quintanilla from Unit Toronto, her new book called Memory Lane. Claudia was so generous to not only send this book, but also earlier had sent me a kit to knit one of the sweaters from this book. The one that I'm going to be knitting is the Granada sweater, and that is the one that involves some crochet techniques in the sleeves. But the book just came in, and I just think this is so stunning. I think for the holidays, this is a really great option to throw maybe on a wish list, as it makes for not only a beautiful kind of coffee table book, but also the designs in here. There really is something for everyone. The photography is stunning, and it's a lot of simple knits that you could choose to embellish. And I think that's really great because the versatility factor, you could choose to knit them without the extra embellishments. But then if you do go the extra mile, you're going to wind up with some really gorgeous, more heirloom style pieces. So thank you so much to Claudia and her team for sending this book. I'm really excited not only to knit the Granada, but there's a few other patterns in here that I have been eyeing, notably the one on the cover. And so thank you so much for sending this over. I know I'm going to get a lot of use out of it, and it's also going to look really beautiful behind me there. So that's the only other little acquisition. There's going to be more next week, I'm assuming, because I have a shopping list for Rhinebeck, but I see that the camera battery is dying, so I will tell you all about how that goes next week. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you would go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If you subscribe and ring the bell, you'll be notified anytime I post a new video, but I do post podcasts just like this one every Saturday morning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And with all that being said, a big ol' thanks for watching. I'll catch you all on the next one. All right, you guys. Bye.